Okay, it is 7 o'clock. Welcome everybody. Really good to see you all. Lots of familiar faces. And my computer decided to play some music for us, which is lovely. So welcome. As always, I will ask you to take a couple of minutes to type in the chat box your name, where are you from, are you interested in ACT? Have you done any training on ACT with us or with somebody else? Why you've decided to join us tonight? Tonight we'll be having this event with Professor Nuno Ferreira, who if you've been to our previous events, you've met Professor Ferreira. He was talking about ACT approach to COVID, and it was a very, very popular event. And we've been working with Nuno for a number of years, delivering introductory course on ACT for us. And for the first time this year, we've decided to provide you with more in-depth training on acceptance and commitment therapy. And of course, when we've made this decision, the lockdown started and Dr. Ferreira couldn't come to England and deliver the course. But thank God for technology, which we've now all mastered. And the course will be going ahead in October on Zoom with breakout rooms and all the other bells and whistles which Zoom offers us. And I must say, we've run yesterday an event with Dr. Andrew Beck on Zoom. And I must say that breakout rooms and everything worked really, really well. And people were very happy with their experience. So I think we'll organize it well and it will be a worthwhile event. But enough of me. Thank you for introducing yourselves. I'll pass the microphone to Paul. And I think Paul has quite a few questions for Nuno tonight to ask both about ACT and why he was so keen on providing you with this skills training on ACT and so on. So I'll stop talking for now. I'll say something else at the end, but enjoy tonight's event. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julia. Welcome, folks. I would like to introduce you to Professor Nuno Ferreira, and I'd like to really just open up a little bit about ACT and particularly what Nuno is going to be doing with us next month. That's on the 19th to the 21st of October, if you're free. And I thought, Nuno, what would be useful to start off with is just to share with people really a little bit about you, because people will not necessarily be aware of the fact that you're actually beaming in at the moment from Cyprus, but that actually when we first started working together, you were based at Edinburgh, in fact. Yeah. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit about what brought you to Edinburgh, if you could say a little bit about your research and your particular interests in ACT, and what you're currently doing back at the, is it University of Nicosia in Cyprus? Yeah, if you could just tell us a little bit about that, please.
Okay, so first of all, just good evening to everyone joining in today. You know, glad to see some familiar faces from previous previous trainings, and even some names that I think I know that I've seen around of colleagues. So very you know, very briefly, you know, just to tell people a little bit how I came into ACT and how ACT sort of came into my life. I mean, I trained originally as a clinical psychologist in Portugal, which, you know, the training is mainly sort of psychodynamic, humanistic. I always had a bit of an interest in behavioral therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. I had a chance to go to Edinburgh as a research assistant to further develop my interest in sort of cognitive behavioral therapy. And I ended up sort of, you know, what was a 6-month research project ended up turning into 11 years in Edinburgh, where I had the privilege of working in several sites within the NHS, when I came into contact with loads of modalities far beyond CBT. So I was there at the sort of at the beginning of the booming of things like DBT, or emotion-focused therapy, and ACT, as well, as it was being introduced within the NHS, with some folks in Edinburgh, especially Dr. David Galanders, who is probably one of the main figures of ACT in the UK. And you know, it was a privilege to then having been able to do my PhD studies with David for a number of years, and having the privilege of being trained by him, and then doing training with him for the doctoral students at the University of Edinburgh later on, when I was lecturing there. So it's been, you know, it's been a big journey. And a few years ago, I ended up moving to Cyprus on a very, if folks are familiar with the ACT model, on a very values-based move of basically coming close to my wife's family and being able to provide a nice environment for our child to grow up and to be around and surrounded by family. So that's how I ended up being here in Cyprus at this moment. As you can see, very nice, clear, starry night. Currently working at the University of Nicosia, but still very sort of, very active internationally within the ACT community, within ACT research. My main interest is really how to apply ACT to chronic illness, and I've developed a sort of a niche speciality of the use of ACT, in particular with people who suffer from gastrointestinal conditions, so IBS, IBD, dysphagia, chronic reflux, and things like that. So that's my sort of my niche area, but anything that's sort of, you know, chronic health conditions would sort of come under the umbrella of my interest.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things I was going to ask about, actually, is that I think one of the things that quite sort of struck me when I first sort of read about your work was that, of course, health conditions are a classic example of something which, in a sense, is there and cannot be changed. Mm-hmm. It is what it is. But the one thing potentially that you can do is to change your relationship with it, mm-hmm. to some extent. Is that a fair description of how? I mean, I know this is overly simplifying things, but is that how ACT works in a situation with physical illness?
It is. I mean, not just with chronic illness, but I mean, as a model in general. I always like to say that ACT is a very simple model, but not simplistic. So the key and core processes of ACT, sometimes they seem to be sort of almost like self-evident truths, but for which, you know, as human beings, we have a lot of baggage and a lot of processes co-occurring that sort of keep us from sometimes either seeing or following those self-evident truths. So, you know, something like you were describing, you know, when people are in this context where they have a certain number of symptoms or a certain number of experiences that are related to, chronic health condition, where there's really no control in terms of, sometimes these might be degenerative conditions. So, there's really no cure, there's really no way of reversing symptoms or effects and stuff like that. So a lot of times, people will have to live with these conditions. And really what ACT a lot of the times helps out is, again, when sometimes people get too attached to trying to control the things that they can't control. When they get too attached to trying to change what cannot be changed, and they stop sort of paying attention or noticing the things that actually matter on their lives, or the things that they've put on hold with, the hope that things will change, that there will be some sort of silver bullet, some cure, some magical pill that's going to suddenly show up and allow them to carry on the lives as they knew it before, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's actually obviously quite pertinent at the moment as well, obviously with the pandemic.
Exactly. Yeah,
that a lot of people will put things on hold which are not necessarily need to be put on hold for that particular purpose.
Yeah. And even I mean, even for what we were talking about before. So this sort of we're in this sort of brave new world where we're providing this training fully online. That's something that I find ACT to be quite handy at the moment, because it sort of draws me back to that core principle of ACT of, how can I serve the same function but in a different form? So how can I serve this function of what I would be doing in a room with a group of people receiving this training? How can I keep the core of what it is that I want to activate in terms of processes in the people receiving the training, the sort of learning that I want to pass on, but doing it in a completely different shape and form, which is using these tools, these virtual tools.
Well, that neatly leads me on, really, I guess, to my next question, because when we first started working together, you were actually providing training as a 2-day introductory ACT course, which was actually part of, still is part of, in fact, our third wave certificate. But I remember when you first raised with me the idea of producing a follow-up course which would be much more experiential and practice-based. And that's what you're going to be doing at this particular event on the 19th to the 21st of next month. Can you just say a little bit about why you thought that was so important? Because it could have been very easy indeed to simply have another 1 or 2 day content delivery day. But yeah, can you say a little bit about why you wanted this to be different?
Well, I mean, the key thing, so the 2-day introductory course is really, a lot of times it's, it's a bit of, it can work as a bit of a shock for some people, because we are talking about a whole new paradigm. So there's a lot to unpack, and usually we take, our fair bit of time during those 2 days to unpack things, and to unpack it in a way that's sort of flavorsome. And those of you who attended, whether it's my training or probably training with other people in ACT, you see that there's a lot of this sort of experiencing the model from within, from a first-person perspective, and that's what we try to do, is try to get people engaged with the processes coming from their own perspective. And that's one way of familiarizing people with the model. But again, that's limited and limiting in the sense of, and then what's the next step? People are going to try to, start using this in their practice. They're going to try to incorporate some of these elements in their practice. And one of the things that I've observed for many years, so for example, during my years at the University of Edinburgh, when our trainees in the doctoral course had the chance to train in ACT as well, one of the things was, overcoming that step between, okay, I know the model, I know some things about the model, I can understand it, but actually putting into practice, usually that takes a bit of a leap of faith. And when it does happen, I think, it's not exclusive to ACT, but that sort of typical those typical doubts that start popping up of, am I doing this correctly? Am I sticking to the model? Or I'm delivering this exercise or this metaphor. Did I do it to a T? Or, was I, that didn't land very well with the person that I was working with. What do I do now? How do I dig myself out of this hole, kind of thing? So a lot of that happens. So I think that what this sort of ACT toolkit course is going to bring is, again, a lot more of this sort of, how do we work these things in practice? How, taking a lot more, so coming out of our first person perspective and going, okay, so how do we use this in our interactions with our clients? How do we, there's going to be some aspect of as well, understanding a little bit more of some of the processes, because and in a bit more detail, but in a way that will allow people to then develop things like, for example, being able to develop your own metaphors, being able to develop your own exercises, being able to be a bit more creative and a bit more playful in terms of what you do without having to follow the ACT recipe book, so where you can sort of improvise a little bit more.
Right, and if I've got this right, folks will have opportunities to practice over the 3 days, and also that in a way, I've actually been thinking that this is potentially one of the advantages of Zoom rooms over actually face-to-face training, because you're going to be in a position to give folks supportive feedback, I understand. You can actually pop in and say hi and check out with people how trying something out is going, and can make suggestions, and that's often quite difficult to do in a room environment in a way, but which will be easier with this, I understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be, for example, there's going to be a lot more privacy and isolation. So using a Zoom room, whilst, usually when we have these face-to-face trainings, when you have a full room of people, even if they're split into smaller groups and working in smaller groups, there's always that sort of low, that hum behind, and, there's distractions and things happening, and, someone coughs or someone gets up or something like that. So, having this, I think it will allow a lot more focus on what's happening. Another thing is because we're going to be, one of the key points during the 3 days is working on language and language processes as they occur naturally in the clinical process. So again, having this sort of increased sense of privacy, and I think it will allow people to sort of focus a little bit more on what's happening language-wise as they're interacting in whether it's role plays, whether it's sort of case discussion, things like that. I think it's going to make it a lot easier to engage with that part of the material.
Okay, that's. I mean, I have to be honest. I'm really looking forward to it. There's a couple of things that sort of cropped up that I wanted to ask about, because they were. I mean, maybe this is my ignorance more than anything else, but I've often heard some folks say that it's quite difficult to produce case formulations with ACT. and you've got a particular section on the training about how to formulate what's going on with the case as really a template for knowing the way to proceed. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I mean, that's one of the great things with ACT is the flexibility. So there's several ways of formulating in ACT, and we can talk about it's almost like different flavors that can be adjusted either to the client or to the therapist. So what we're going to do is sort of, look at how, how all these different presentations of how to formulate an ACT, and we're going to look at the function behind it. So, what's the essential things that we're trying, and the essential process that we're trying to activate, and how these are displayed across these different types of formulation. And hopefully by doing that, folks will naturally gravitate to, one particular model that they feel, okay, this is more my style, and I can use this, and I can understand the function of what's happening here and how this relates to the model in itself, or they can even sort of personalize it with, well, I'm seeing a client, this would probably resonate with that client, and and what I'm doing right now might not resonate. So and so we're going through we're going to go through different sort of ways of conceptualizing, and different ways of again building that conceptualization with a client, which is the most important part, is that we're not just taking notes and making our little hexagrams and stuff like that. We want this shared conceptualization, and we want it to be an experiential shared conceptualization. So we're going to be working as well on how how to have that experiential sense come across with the clients as well.
Okay, I mean, can you just give us a simple illustration of how with the client about how that formulation might work?
Well, I mean, one of the classic examples, in, for example, a very simple way of formulating with clients is using what we call the matrix, which was basically a formulation tool developed by Kevin Polk and Benjamin Schondorf, which is a very simple, getting people to notice, for example, are they doing movements away from or close to? Are they engaged mainly with their mind, or are they engaged with their experience? And you can sort of, use that as a sort of a very simple plot, a sort of very simple cross matrix plot, where you can sort of plot people. So are you, a lot in your head and trying to get away from things, or are you with your experience and sort of moving towards the things that matter to you? So that's, a very simple example of the different ways that we can use ACT principles to create formulations.
So just so, because I find this quite interesting, just so I can get that clear in my head, in that, am I getting this right, that in a sense, formulation within ACT is a way of framing something, of almost creating a metaphor which might be helpful for both the therapist and the client in terms of which direction to move forward in. Have I got that right?
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the things that and again, the importance of language and symbolic language in ACT is to create, again, to co-create with the client, our own sense of language that sort of focuses on the functions of, whether it's what the client is doing that's not in the service of their values, or what they want to do in the service of their values, but co-creating that sort of language where we don't necessarily need to be talking about specific instances, but where we can talk about the functions of what those instances usually represent. And for that, we're gonna talk a little bit about one of the core principles of ACT, which is RFT, or relational frame theory, and how that sort of came about, and how RFT, for folks out there, basically RFT is a behavioral account of language. So how language can be created and can be influenced using behavioral, basic behavioral processes and understanding. And because that in itself, it's with that understanding of language, we can do, we can move these functions, and we can again, that's really what's going to unlock that key for doing sort of deeper conceptualization, because you're going to start doing things like noticing certain types of phrasing and certain types of words that clients use, and how in the sort of what's the function of that in the overall picture. How does that relate to the processes that are keeping them stuck, that are keeping them in this suffering position? And then you're going to notice how how can we transform that function, and using language processes ourselves, because we're psychotherapists, we're trying, we're bound to use language as well. So we're really going to go deep into that sort of transformative power of language, and how we can harness the processes that are getting people stuck into something that's a bit more productive, a bit more adaptable, a bit more workable.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting what you say there, because one of the things that where relational frame theory originally struck me as being most useful was actually, for me, it actually provided a way forward in terms of trying to work with cross-cultural issues and addressing, and I don't just mean that between countries, I mean that within or between communities within countries, because often it's also reflected in the different ways in which language is actually used, and a focus on process and function, I found a really quite liberating, really, because I think that many people, when they're confronted by cross-cultural issues, almost freeze and say, I don't know anything about this culture. How do I proceed? And I found it was a very useful and helpful idea, really. Yeah.
And that's one of the great things of again of ACT and RFT in general, is that because they again, simple but not simplistic model, it boils down to very sort of basic human processes that it doesn't matter if you're born and raised in the UK, or if you're a citizen of the world that's been around and communicated and with a lot of cultures, whether you're in Bangladesh, whether you're in Nigeria or something like that. There's always these processes that are inherent to being a human being. And I think that this sort of understanding of language and understanding of the functions of language does bridge that gap that might be more about the content of the things that surrounded you as you were growing up, in your development, your learning history, and sort of boils them down to the sort of more essential parts of what it is to be human, and therefore you can find a common language there.
Again, can you give us a sort of example of that, of where you've used that with a client and how that's actually made a difference?
Well, I mean, so for example, I mean, one of the things that clients do a lot, for example, in terms of languaging, things like, they would say something like, you can't understand what I'm experiencing. Okay, so that's basically, a very common, what we would call a framing of opposition that people do, as in, you don't have my experience, so you could never understand what's going on with me. Now, what we can do is really sort of, you know, we can use that and that frame of opposition in terms of, you know, okay, so how can we make that useful in the therapy room? You know, if we get stuck on the, yes, I'm different from you and you're different from me, and obviously I would never know, you know, if I were you, I would, you know, I would never know what it is to be you. I've never walked a mile in your shoe, kind of thing. You know, obviously that would be the same perspective as the client is coming, which is sort of very defeatist type of, you know, this is never going to go anywhere. One of the things that we can do is sort of transform that stimulus function, where that opposition, so what's that opposition in the service of? Because you're relating to me that opposition. So what brought you here to relate to me that opposition? So, and by doing that, we're taking this frame of opposition and we're sort of expanding it to, okay, you could have, you know, that you could have said that to the mirror. You know, you don't have to come into the therapy room to tell me that I can never experience what you've experienced. So there must be something there attached, and it might be, you know, again, seeking care, seeking help, you know, or just mainly sharing, you know, people don't know what I've been through. So we can transform that function from something that, you know, could become very easily a barrier in the communication into something that's a lot more workable. Okay, so there's some curiosity here, you know, there's a level of exposure that in itself is already some form of movement going on.
So sorry. So I was going to say, so in a way, one thing that it's useful for is being able to manage or finesse what might actually be points of conflict or resistance between the client and the therapist. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, and that's one of the things that again, the model in itself is really good. Is sort of, you know, pinpointing those moments of stuckness and you know, and using the skills in itself. So both you know, as I always say, you know, both therapists and clients, you know, we're both using the same processes and we're both using the same skills. So just as the client might get stuck with some processes in their lives, so do we get stuck in the therapy room with some of those very similar processes. So we can use some of the skills that get us out of those processes during such an interaction. So, you know, it's very common, you know, I find it very common to use just basic, you know, small bursts of mindfulness when I'm getting stuck with a client, or doing things like, you know, sharing, you know, how am I relating to my thoughts in terms of what's happening right here, right now in the therapy room, and how is that influencing my behavior towards the client and things like that. So that's all of that sort of comes together. I think the thing that's probably most difficult or more challenging, especially when you're beginning to use ACT, is that the model itself is quite fluid and it's quite dynamic in nature. And it's one of the things that, for example, that's why it's important to have a good grasp of conceptualization. That's why it's important to have a good grasp of language and language processes, because these are going to be dynamic throughout, you know, throughout the whole therapeutic process. And sometimes even within a session, you might sort of shift several times. So there's an element of, you know, the more I can understand those basic functions, the more I can do this dance of, you know, shifting goals, shifting attention, shifting, you know, the functions in terms of what's happening in the room, paying attention to this process and being able to let go of that process that's occurring at that moment. So that's really what what I think this course is going to be about is sort of being able to do that dance a little bit more comfortably, where, you know, it's really like learning how to dance, where you're not counting your steps anymore, and you're actually trying to focus on enjoying a bit more of the music, a bit more of the rhythm, you know, and you're getting in the flow of things.
Yeah, so it's maybe this is an obvious thing to say, but it's unlikely that anyone's ever going to totally manualize ACT. It's very,
yeah. I think it's a common disclaimer in all ACT manuals that, you know, whatever this is just one way of doing ACT. There's plenty of other ways, and there's you know, again, I think there's always a very keen message of, you know, here are some principles, and as long as you understand the basic principles, you'll be able to adapt to the context that you're going to be working with. And again, the context might be a specific population, it might be a specific client, it might be a specific day of a specific client. So context here is really sort of, you know, it sort of goes across all sorts of hierarchies that you can imagine.
Yeah. The other thing that's just suddenly crossed my mind that I've not mentioned, of course, is that this particular course is part of a British Psychological Society approved certificate in acceptance and commitment therapy. And that is one of the very, very few, to my knowledge, professional body approved courses in ACT. And there's no real, if I understand this correctly, no real established universally accepted accreditation for ACT at this point in time. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that sort of you know, it comes a little bit with the values of the model. However, there's a sort of you know, an implicit understanding of a certain level of training that people will have to go through, and a certain level of things like you know, supervision and supervised practice that will lead people to, again, to be a confident ACT practitioner. And when we say confident, is again in the ACT sense of confidence of, you know, with faithfulness to the model. So you know, yeah, there aren't really any sort of you know, there's not like, you know, like you see in CBT, where there's a very sort of almost manualized route into, and the sort of different levels that you need to achieve to become a CBT therapist. I mean, there's a movement within the ACT community to make these things a little bit more not official, but, you know, at least with a different type of recommendations for, you know, what it is and how do you become an ACT therapist. Sure. So this sort of sense of, you know, having at least some initial training, having a sort of more intermediate type of training, using case supervision or individual practice supervision, you know, doing things like case studies and stuff like that. Becomes then part of what it is to, you know, that you sort of need to go through to become sort of more confident in your practice.
And that's certainly one of the reasons that in terms of being part of that developing process, that it was really important to us that we seek out and get BPS approval for the course, because we can, it's inevitable that that accreditation is going to come universally, and we want to be in the forefront of being a part of that. So.
And it's a quality assurance, especially for the clients, they are working with people who have had an adequate level of training, who've had an adequate level of supervision by people who are experts in the field, so that so that we can confidently say that, again, even though the ACT psychotherapist term does not exist per se, but that we can say that at least, I'm a counseling psychologist who's confident in using the ACT model, or I'm a clinical psychologist that's confident, or I'm a general practitioner, whatever it is that is confident in using the ACT model.
Okay. Well, I will thank you very much indeed. I'll pass things over to Julia at this particular point. And thanks very much, Nuno. Thank you very much indeed.
A pleasure as always.
Thank you very much. I've got a few questions, but I will give Nuno and Paul time to recuperate and rest their voice a little bit, and just answer a couple of questions which were about the course and how we're going to run it. Yes, Amanda and I think Tracy mentioned that they can't make these particular dates, and asking whether the course will be available as a recording or whether we're going to run it again. First of all, the course will not be available as a recording because, as you've understood through the interview, the course is experiential. There will be a lot of work and practice and fine-tuning of your skills. So we can't give it out as a recording. You'll have to be in the room and experience the course and work with Nuno in order to fine-tune those skills. So that's the first answer. In terms of running the course again, we definitely won't be running it this year because the year is coming to the end. In terms of this academic year, well, we'll have to have a look how the first course runs, whether we've got enough interest and whether Nuno is happy to come back. And we might actually talk to people and maybe shape it slightly differently, maybe 3 days, but not 3 days altogether, maybe once a week, maybe once a month, something like that. So to make sure that we accommodate your needs, we understand that taking 3 days off can be problematic. So the first time we run it as it is, but in what shape it will come back, I can't say exactly, but I hope it will come back. We actually talked with Nuno about developing our own internal accreditation for ACT and maybe continuing with improving the skills, running master classes, maybe running some written assignment, providing supervision, group supervision, things like that. So people who train with us in ACT have support from other ACT practitioners who are at the same level of training with them. So we are definitely going to continue with developing this course, and we are very lucky to have Nuno on board with us. I must say, listening to this conversation, we've run ACT introductory course for many years, and I've listened to one delivered by Nuno, I've listened to one delivered by Dr. Fiona Kennedy, one delivered by Joe Oliver, and I'm sitting here thinking, oh gosh, I know everything about ACT. No, I don't. And it was fascinating just to know how much more is it to the model and to doing it. There's lots of questions about specific clients, and I will just ask a few because, for example, Sabita asked right in the beginning whether ACT can be used with patients detained under Section 3 in inpatient settings with schizophrenia, substance misuse, and so on. Can you answer that, please, Nuno?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually one of the earliest randomized controlled trials for ACT was done with patients with psychosis. And it was especially if memory serves me correctly, especially with patients where negative symptoms seem to be predominant, it seems that ACT is quite effective in addressing negative symptoms. But at the same time, it's also quite useful in terms of promoting things like medication adherence, which tends to be an issue with patients with psychosis. So yeah, it can be used, and it can be targeting different levels of the work that we usually do with patients with psychosis.
A similar question about whether ACT can be used for autistic individuals, children, young people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and again, working with different aspects of the model. So, for example, one of the key areas that you would be working with people with on the autistic spectrum, or especially young children in the autistic spectrum, would be the using the principles of relational frame theory. So there's a lot of evidence of ACT and ACT principles and RFT principles unlocking quite a lot of potential in people with autism spectrum disorders, improving communication, enhancing learning of key skills with these populations. So similarly, I saw the question in terms of using it with young people. ACT is, it's really sort of cross-populational. I mean, we can use ACT principles from very young ages all the way to older adults. So,
thank you. Thank you. An interesting question from Joyce, who is a psychiatrist and is keen to become a psychotherapist. Mm-hmm. And she's asking at what level we will consider somebody fairly new to psychotherapy. Before I pass the question to Nuno, I just wanted to say, in order to sign up for this 3-day on ACT, you need to demonstrate that you have some initial introductory training on ACT, either with us, and it can be taken as a recording, and currently the recording of introductory training on ACT with Nuno is on 50% discount, so you can do it with us. Or if you've attended introductory course of any other organization, please send us the information of what you've done and you will be accepted to the course. To somebody who is working as a psychiatrist, I guess, my guess is as long as they've done the introductory training, they'll be very welcome. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, as long as they have again a basic understanding of the model, they're more than welcome. Because again, we're not going to be focusing again on the on the basic principles of the model. We're going to be focusing on how to apply those basic principles. So we need some sort of familiarization with what these concepts mean. What is it that we're talking about when we're talking about values in the ACT framework? What is it when we're talking about diffusion? So these are sort of assumed to be sort of prior knowledge, and we're going to be working really on how to bridge that gap between our sort of more intellectualized conceptualization of the model into the sort of more practical use of the model.
Thank you. And to finish with the question from Kelly, I think it was, asking what would you recommend to read on ACT? I guess for somebody who is in the very beginning of their journey, mm-hmm. What would you recommend?
Well, I mean, there's I think at this point, there's so many introductory readings. I always find Russ Harris's book and books. He's a prolific writer. So I would even say, take your pick from any of Russ Harris's books. There, is an excellent communicator of ACT and ACT principles, and he makes it so palatable and so easy to understand. So, any of the books by Russ. If you want to be a bit more formal and sort of, drink from the original fountain, Steve Hayes, I think it was last year or the year before, he just launched a new book. I want to get the title correct. So it's called A Liberated Mind, The Essential Guide to ACT. So that's fairly recent, and I think you can get it, easily through Amazon. I think there's a Kindle version and stuff like that. So it's fairly accessible. So that's one of, there you get the key principles from one of the originators of ACT as well.
I must say that also on psychotherapy DVDs, we have a lot of DVDs on ACT. And also from Steve Hayes, and you can see demonstrations as well as listen about the theory. So thank you very much. We've overrun today, but I think it was worth it. Thank you very much, Nuno, for joining us, and everyone else. Before I say goodbye, I just wanted to let you know about our future sessions. On the 1st of October, so far this year, you've had sessions with people who you've already met. On the 1st of October, it's a brand new presentation from Deb Dana, who will be talking about polyvagal theory and trauma. And Deb Dana has worked with Stephen Porges and written a few books with him. So I'll be fascinated, and I do invite you to come and join us on the 1st of October. And then on the 22nd of October, we've got Professor Mick Cooper, who will also be delivering a course for us later on. So please just note those 2 dates down, 1st of October, 22nd of October. And as always, we'll send you an email with your registration link. And also wanted to say, for those who are doing Master Practitioner Diploma in CBT with us, we've started this week our absolutely free tutorials in CBT with Paul Grantham. The only condition is that you should attend at least one course from the Master Practitioner Diploma modules, and then you can join these free tutorials, and they will be on Mondays, and the next one is on the 12th of October. So thank you very much for coming, and see you hopefully again very soon. Thank you, Nuno, again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye now.
Bye.